Today, space is essential not only to our way of life, it's absolutely critical to the modern way of war. GPS, ATMs, cell phones, gas pumps, traffic lights, power grids, guided missiles, surveillance, RPAs, ground combat control. There's no such thing as a day without space operations. You just don't see them. Earth is only half the battle. Cyber attacks and jamming of our satellites. Microsatellites that can create a debris field. At 17,000 miles an hour, a piece of metal the size of a coin can be weaponized.
Hi, I'm Pat Hubble, Candorful co-founder and executive director. Happy Veterans Day, and thank you to all the veterans and military families joining us tonight. Candorful is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we provide job interview prep for transitioning military veterans and military spouses. Since launching in 2018, Candorful, with the help of over 100 volunteer interview coaches from sponsoring companies, has supported almost 3,000 military job candidates with interview prep and practice to help them make a smooth career transition. Their support is essential for keeping military families strong and resilient. If you are excited about what Candorful does and want to be part of the impact, you can help by making a donation. We'll be dropping our donation link in the chat throughout tonight's event. Your support makes our impact possible. Thank you to our awesome sponsors who helped us bring this Veterans Day event to you. Our gold sponsors, Booz Allen Hamilton, Vertex Pharmaceuticals, and Amazon. Our silver sponsor, Groundswell, and bronze sponsor, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. Thank you for enabling our impact. I'm really excited by this space panel we have put together for you tonight, and we've got some cool and fun trivia questions. Winners will receive this book, Space Shuttle, A Photographic Journey with a Foreword by Chris Ferguson, our astronaut in residence for this evening. And so I'd like to introduce Guy Snodgrass, retired U.S. Navy commander, former Top Gun pilot, and your panel moderator for this evening. Guy, so great to have you back with us this year.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. It's great to be with you and with everyone who's joining us for the space panel. I know we've got a lot to accomplish with a relatively short amount of time, so I'll go ahead and jump into some introduction for our panelists, and then we'll move forward with tonight's events. So we're incredibly honored to be joined by 4 separate panelists. 3 are from the United States Space Force, and the 4th is from both a Navy background, NASA background as an astronaut. We'll start with our most senior. We've got Lieutenant General Nina Armagno. She is currently the Chief of Staff for the United States Space Force. She had spent the first part of her career, about 32 years, in the United States Air Force. She rose up into the rank of Major General before transferring over, and she is now the first female general officer for the U.S. Space Force. So, General, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Guy. It's great to be here.
We're also going to be joined by former Navy captain, former astronaut, and currently a gentleman who is working with Boeing, Captain Chris Ferguson. So, Chris, thank you very much for being with us this evening. If you go to Wikipedia, just like with General Armagno, you can see a wealth of information about Chris Ferguson, his background, his exploits, his multiple space shuttle missions. So, Chris, thank you very much for being with us.
This guy, great to be here.
So we have General Armagno, who's going to be able to talk to us a lot about the strategic level of the U.S. Space Force. We're going to be joined also by our third panelist. This is Colonel Raj Agrawal. Raj has a deep background with both the U.S. Air Force and now as a colonel in the U.S. Space Force. His current title, I want to make sure I get this correct, is the incoming commander for Delta II for the United States Space Force. So we'll be leaning on him to learn a lot more about that middle tier, that organizational level of the Space Force. So Raj, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. I appreciate it. Glad to be here.
And then finally, we've got our fourth panelist, Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Higgins. Chris is the Deputy for Joint Task Force Space Defense Future Operations Division in the United States Space Command. He's also a member of the United States Space Force. Chris, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So just a couple quick housekeeping items before we start our conversation. Pat had mentioned that we're going to be giving away some gifts this evening. in the nice coffee table book that she held up about the background of the space shuttle and the photos there. So the way we're going to facilitate this is by asking a series of questions throughout today's event. So I'll just pose a question that we've come up with for you. And if you could use the chat as one of the members of this conversation, or excuse me, not the panelists, but the visitors or the attendees who are watching, go ahead and type your answer. Pat will be surveying those responses. And when she sees the first correct response, she'll note that, she'll acknowledge you in the chat. And at the end of tonight's program, I'll go ahead and announce the 3 winners. So with that being said, the very first trivia question that we had, which we're just getting warmed up here. So this will be a little bit of a gimme for most of you. But the question is this: what famous drink was used by early astronauts up through the Apollo 11 mission because it was packed with vitamin? So what famous drink was used by early astronauts up through the Apollo 11 mission? So I think that one's being answered pretty quickly. With that being said, as we continue to go through those answers, if we could roll our first sponsorship video, this one will be from Booz Allen Hamilton, one of our gold sponsors.
Wondering what the civilian world has to offer? Where you'll fit in? If you'll find the same sense of purpose the military has given you. Upskilling into a tech role can be your path to a purposeful and future-focused career. Your leadership experience, passion to serve, and mission expertise make you the perfect fit for a career in tech. We need you to help us defend against cyber attacks, use AI to beat our adversaries, and build the solutions that will enable the next generation of warfighters. Defend the future. Lead with us.
All right, so welcome back. I want to start off the conversation with you, General. If you wouldn't mind, maybe we have a very diverse audience who's attending tonight's session. So if you wouldn't mind, I mean, a lot of people are very familiar with the armed forces. They're familiar with the United States Air Force, but the United States Space Force is our newest branch of the military services. So if you could just maybe give us a quick overview of the important role that Space Force plays and how it differentiates itself from the Air Force.
Absolutely, Guy. Thank you for that question. And to everybody in the audience, happy Veterans Day. It's really neat to be celebrating Veterans Day in this manner with these awesome panelists. Those of us who are in the Space Force, hey, we might be the first Guardians you've ever met. So the way I want to talk about the Space Force is kind of the who, what, when, where, and why we were established. You know, who are we? What do we do? And I think that will get after Guy's question. So we were established on December 20th in 2019 when President Trump signed the National Defense Authorization Act, establishing the 6th and newest branch of the military. So it was really kind of almost shocking to some of us who thought that the service wasn't going to be established, but we were going to be, told to continue to plan for a new service. But with the stroke of a pen, almost, the service was created, and we had one person in it, and it was General Raymond, because that law also established him as our Chief of Space Operations. But we are a service, and we are on equal footing with all the other services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard. We're made up of a little bit over 14,000 personnel on our way to our cap of 18,600. That's what Congress has authorized. We are about half and half, about half active duty, officer and enlisted, and about half civilian. So that's going to be unique compared to the other services as well. What do we do? Well, we, in law, were given 3 missions: protect and defend the space domain. So that's protect and defend American assets in space. That's a pretty broad mission statement. Deter aggression in, from, and to the space domain. And 3, conduct operations in the space domain. The same year the Space Force was stood up, U.S. Space Command was also established. U.S. Space Command is a combatant command, and so not to confuse the two, we as a service organize, train, and equip, just like the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. We organize, train, and equip Guardians to conduct space operations missions. And the combatant command is responsible for actually executing those missions under a combatant command's authority each and every day. What kind of missions are we talking about? Well, we launch rockets. We launch the very satellites that we design, build. Then we launch, we test, and we operate. We train our guardians to be operators and warfighters. And the types of missions we're talking about, GPS. GPS is a worldwide, gift to society. But those satellites are commanded and controlled by the United States Space Force. We also have weather satellites, and we provide weather, very important to have weather with every single joint operation. Communications through space, missile warning. We do space domain awareness, where we track everything in space, in the low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and geostationary Earth orbit. We also do electronic warfare as a newly declassified mission that we can talk about. So these missions are what we do. This is who we are, and I think if you really want to discern the Space Force from the Air Force, the Air Force primarily goes after air superiority. So they're the experts in their domain. And we are the preeminent space power. We provide space superiority as the Air Force provides air superiority in their domain. And that's our intention, and we will be striving to, satisfy that mission each and every day.
Thanks, General. I appreciate that. Yeah, it, like you said, with the stroke of a pen was the Space Force created. I remember I was on Mattis's personal staff when Space Force was created. We were weighing the pros and the cons, the recommendation for the president. And so I remember when he made the announcement, and we said, all right, we're carrying forward with the U.S. Space Force. And, I think that's, as we continue this conversation, that's what a lot of our attendees are going to walk away with is that in some respects, from my background as an F-18 pilot, you don't necessarily think about space a lot, but then suddenly as you start peeling back the onion, you realize there's so much occurring in space, communications, like you mentioned, early warning, et cetera. So we'll bring in some of the other panelists to help expound on that theme. But before we do so, I'd like to kind of skip over to another agency and organization. We mentioned we have former astronaut Chris Ferguson, who's with us today. And so, Chris, I kind of wanted to, ask, so General Armagno just talked about the U.S. Space Force and the fact that it's our newest branch of the military forces. Well, NASA's been around for quite some time. I mean, we've all grown up watching NASA movies, watching space shuttle missions, watching rocket launches. So I'm just kind of curious, starting off at that 30,000 foot level, can you maybe bring us into the just perspective of what was it like to be an admiral, or excuse me, what was it like to be an astronaut? And then as you move that forward into your career at Boeing, kind of how has that changed your perspective from being in uniform as an astronaut to now being on the commercial side of the house?
Yeah. Hey, Guy, thank you. So, hey, first, let me sort of latch on to Lieutenant General's comments about wishing everybody a happy Veterans Day. I had the privilege and honor of spending 26 years in the Navy, and I'd have to say, including my time with NASA, my time in the Navy was probably the most joyous of my life. I'm so proud of my service, and I know there's a lot of current and former service members, watching tonight, and I'd like to thank you very much for your service. But yes, I did. I joined NASA as at the time Navy Lieutenant Commander in 1998, and while I was with NASA, I was promoted on up the chain, which was it was an honor to represent the U.S. Navy as a part of the astronaut corps, and got to had the privilege of serving on 3 different space shuttle flights right up until the program ended in 2011. And in fact, had the privilege to command the very last space shuttle flight, which was a little bittersweet, right? We hated to see the space shuttle go away, but we knew that these human spaceflight programs are very costly, and in order to afford the next generation, right, we had to sort of stand down from what we were doing for a period of time. But that really has set the stage for where we are today. We have, NASA has fostered, I'll call it, a new generation of human spaceflight, in that these flights to low Earth orbit to service the International Space Station are actually crewed by NASA astronauts, but they're aboard, relatively private spaceships. SpaceX and Boeing provide passenger service, if you will call it that, to the International Space Station under contract to NASA. And the reason that has transpired is because NASA wants to focus on their exploration mission. So it's very timely, as a matter of fact, because the follow-on to the space shuttle is really an exploration mission that will leave low Earth orbit, and it will go back to first cislunar space in and around the moon, and eventually, of course, the goal is Mars. And it's very timely in that the first flight of what they call Artemis, which is, I'll call it the Saturn V follow-on, right? The most powerful rocket we've ever launched from the United States of America, is scheduled for launch from the Kennedy Space Center. It was originally Monday, but if you don't like the weather in Florida, just blink because it'll change. And here in November, we actually have a hurricane that's bearing down on the east coast of Florida. So they've actually pushed the launch date back, unbelievably, only 2 days, which is great. But hopefully next Wednesday, a week from tonight, we'll have an opportunity to see just an incredible launch of a vehicle that is currently uncrewed. But it will take a couple laps around the moon. It'll spend some time out there and then return about 2.5 to 3 weeks later. So, very interesting time in space. And Guy, I'm sure we'll get there, but there's more to it, right? There's more to the story. There's an awful lot of activity at the Kennedy Space Center. I'll call it the Wild West of space exploration. As in comparison to a largely government-run program. For the first half a century of human spaceflight. But it's very active. It's exciting, and it's great to be a part of it. And I'm just happy that I have the fortunate to have been participant, in the NASA Space Shuttle program, and also commercial human spaceflight as we go forward in the future.
Thank you very much, Chris. Appreciate that. Like you said, there's so much we could dive into there. I know that I was the benefactor of a lot of NASA research and research that was conducted by Boeing. When I first started flying the F-18, we had some controllability issues, and then some of the research that NASA had performed resulted in changes to our flight software because of the airworthiness program that they had going on was able to be carried over and ported into us. So like you said, it's not just necessarily space shuttle missions, it's research, it's development. There's so many things that we can peel the onion back on. But before we do, I wanted to switch over back to the Space Force real quick. I wanted to talk with Colonel Agrawal, bring him into the conversation because there's something that General Armagno kind of touched on that I'd like to explore a little further with you. So for those of you who are participating today and you're watching, there's a couple keystone documents that the United States will release every several years that are going to talk about what the key priorities are for the United States to remain successful on the world stage. We've got one of those is the National Defense Strategy. And so just recently, about a week ago, the Biden administration released the latest National Defense Strategy. And if you were to take a look through it, you can see that throughout the document, there's a new and incredible reliance on space and on cyber. And in some cases, those elements are actually intertwined. So the other key element is this concept of how contested the international environment has become. So I'm just kind of curious, Raj, from your perspective, what role will the Space Force play in this newly contested region? I mean, General Armagno touched on the entirety of the mission set for the Space Force, but how are you seeing some of those that domain being contested?
Hey, Guy, thanks. That's a great question. And I appreciate the opportunity to join Candorful, and certainly also want to wish everyone a happy Veterans Day. I'm a first-generation American. Getting to serve in uniform is still a rare privilege for me. And we have a very diverse team in the Space Force, and we've really prioritized that diversity because we need to be able to capitalize on the agility and the kind of different ways of thinking as we now enter into what you have described as a contested environment, and certainly as the president is articulating the national strategies and the defense strategy talks about integrated deterrence. So I want to take a moment to talk about that, but let me first take a few decades step back to where both NASA and the Air Force at the time, we've been doing space operations for a very long time. So space operations isn't new. And the idea that we've been building all of what we call our instruments of power, the way that we are a nation, we've built all of that onto this infrastructure that is highly dependent on space. And the US rose into this position where we largely were able to project our values and our norms Sometimes other nations, particularly dictatorships, were not very comfortable with the values that we espoused and the ways that we were influencing democracy and those values around the world. China was one of those nations that saw that the United States was highly dependent, has become highly dependent on space and cyber, and looked for opportunities to undermine that. So while we've been doing space a long time, the context within which we now do space operations has to take into account that there are other nations that have fielded capability to contest that and what we are now calling space superiority. And so the Space Force was not just stood up as a fun idea, but it was stood up in order to address this very challenging defense issue, security issue, which is if the United States is highly dependent on space and everything we do from ATM transactions to agriculture to helping other nations with border control and their own security and our partnerships that we have with our allies and partners. And certainly, as we've all seen, the commercial sector has really capitalized on the security that we provide in the space domain. If all of that's dependent on a safe and secure space domain, then there needs to be a military service stood up that's focused solely on that, not relying on what General Armagno and I were a part of, the U.S. Air Force, which I was proud to be an airman, and I was proud to do space operations as part of the U.S. Air Force. But now that we're part of the U.S. Space Force, we're able to focus solely on the discipline of space power, what that means to provide the president independent options when it comes to just defending the space domain with space capability, and certainly as part of joint operations and projecting joint power. What does that mean for a Guardian to be a joint warfighter? I think we have to think about those as two distinct issues, and certainly develop our Guardians to think as space experts, and also to think of ourselves as joint warfighters, operating with folks like you in an F-18, and even to the point of, and we still do this today, protecting human spaceflight. And we work very closely with NASA on a daily basis to provide for that. And now that the Department of Commerce is also standing up their role in protecting the space domain, I think we're really at an incredible place in history to ask the American people, hey, come join any aspect of this. The U.S. Space Force, space industry, Department of Commerce, NASA, all of us need you, and we need you as you are, and we want to take advantage of the uniqueness and talent that you bring so that we can quickly adapt to this new environment and help restore peace and security.
Yeah, I think you touched on something really important there, and I know the General had mentioned this as well, and that is just the type of emphasis that gets placed. When you elevate the space elements of the Air Force into its own separate service, you're certainly highlighting it. You're providing some programmatic and some budgetary certainty, and especially from a strategic standpoint, a much clearer path forward. And I think for all of our attendees, when you think about it, once again, we'll kind of circle back around through the panelists to dive a little deeper, but space is really all about technology, right? I mean, there's so much today, everything's technology. And when you look around the world, especially with, as several administrations have talked about, the rising competitiveness that we have with China. I mean, you look at the amount of space launches they're conducting, et cetera. It's a highly contested domain. And so I think both you and the General have done a really nice job kind of laying out the groundwork for why it's so important to be pursuing that avenue. So with that being said, you mentioned one other thing. So I wanted to bring in our fourth panelist, Lieutenant Colonel.
Real quick, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Hey, so real quick, I didn't want to leave that as the point. I don't know that we're necessarily in a technology race. Certainly there's a technology aspect to this, but I do think the strength that we have as America is our people and what we bring to that as American people, and our values and our ability to integrate all of what we bring to get after a threat. So I would offer that it's people that solve that problem, not necessarily or not only technology.
Yeah, 100%. We had a big poster up at Top Gun that made that point, that it was the person in the cockpit, not just the plane you're flying, that made all the difference. So
right.
Point's well taken. That being said, you also touched on the fact that the Guardians, the men and women who are actually conducting this mission, are the lifeblood of the service. And so I wanted to bring in Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Higgins to the conversation, because when you look at our panelists, he's right where the rubber meets the road. As a lieutenant colonel, I remember my days as a Navy commander, as a squadron commander. you are senior enough to kind of look up the echelon, if you will, and you can look to senior leaders and you understand their mission intent, what they are trying to accomplish. But then you're also right there with the men and women who are conducting the missions on a day in and day out type of basis. So, Chris, with that as a little bit of a lead in, I'd love to hear your perspective from that more tactical level of the U.S. Space Force. Kind of what are you seeing as the force is being stood up, and how will the men and women you lead in the near future be contributing to that mission?
Yeah, thank you again for having me. And I'd like to also extend a happy Veterans Day to the community all in attendance today. So when we're talking about the stand up of the Space Force in general, there was a lot going on. So talking about those initiatives, I'd like to focus on what I would view as the top three. So first being establishing our culture as a Space Force and what our warfighting culture also is. So when we have the stand up of the Space Force, you're looking at a force primarily made up of those Space Force or Air Force space personnel. That was the case for maybe about the first year or so, but now we're talking about a situation where now we're onboarding personnel from these other service branches, and these individuals bring with them different experiences, different viewpoints of the environment, the world, the battlefield. You're talking about Army personnel who have many deployments overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan who see things differently. So it's very important for us to really get a broader understanding of who we are, where we came from, but also where we are going into the future, as you've been hearing a lot about our diverse backgrounds, because a lot of that is what enables our success on the battlefield. The second effort would be the development and improvement of our professional and military education. So for those who may not be tracking, Space Force senior developmental education and our intermediate developmental education will now take place at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. This will allow us to have a more tailored academics to help tackle those unique and dynamic challenges that we face in the space environment. Looking at our personnel that we are looking to onboard into the future, there is a heavy emphasis on STEM curriculum, STEM degrees, to ensure that we are having personnel who can address these challenges and tackle those unique situations that we do face with the space environment, especially with how technical things are becoming. And then third is the organizational development. With the stand-up of the Space Force, what may have worked for us under the Air Force doesn't necessarily work for us now. So we've already gone through a lot of transformational change. That change will continue to occur, and you will eventually see a force that enables us to organize, train, and equip those combat-ready forces in a resource-constrained environment.
Terrific. Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate that. I know we're getting ready to gear up for our second round of questions, but as I look at the clock, we're about 15 minutes in. So what I want to do real quick was go ahead and pose the second question to the audience for a copy of the Space Shuttle book. And if you would respond via chat, and as soon as you start responding, we'll go ahead and roll the next video for our second sponsor for Vertex. So the second question is going to be, what was the year of the first human flight? So the year of the first human flight, and astronaut Chris Ferguson, you're not allowed to participate.
Brave is our newest airline here at Vertex Pharmaceuticals. Our mission is really to support veterans and first responders, both in the Vertex community, employees, as well as communities that Vertex does business in. We feel a personal obligation to support both our veterans as well as our first responders. It's important that we recognize that and do something back for them.
The community is really supportive of one another.
Most of our Brave members are not necessarily veterans or first responders or former first responders.
You don't have to be former military or first responder to be a part of Brave.
My favorite thing about being involved is selfishly how it makes me feel. I think what we're doing is wonderful. It benefits both our employees by benefiting others. And that's just a feeling that sometimes I get overwhelmed with, honestly.
All right, so welcome back. We'll go ahead and continue the conversation. Let's jump back over to General Armagno, because she brought up a couple of things that I thought were really interesting. General, you touched on, of course, the breadth and the entirety of the missions that are occurring with U.S. Space Force. As you kind of forecast into the next 3 to 5 to maybe even 7 years, What do you see as being, from your mind, what's the biggest priority, or maybe the biggest three priorities that the Space Force will have to get right as a service to really set its imprimatur moving forward?
Well, we actually have a brand new Chief of Space Operations, General Salty Saltzman, just came on board last week as CSO number 2. And so the official, top 3 priorities are still forthcoming. But I predict that it's going to be much of the same of what we've been doing. We're going to evolve our thinking, and we'll evolve with our priorities. But we definitely have to make our systems that I mentioned earlier more resilient to the threat that Raj mentioned. Very specifically, Russia and China building systems that can take down and harm our satellites in any orbit. The threat is real, and every time we get an intelligence update, the briefers say, "Well, we predicted that they'd be here at a certain time, but they are well beyond." Both Russia and China, well beyond what the original predictions have been. And so our systems are vulnerable. I mean, they were all designed and built for a benign environment long before the Space Force was even conceived of. And so the first thing we have to do is make those systems resilient. And that means taking high-valued assets that are, they take 20 years to design, build, launch, test, and check out. Kind of like a 5th or 6th gen fighter. I mean, those exquisite systems take a really long time to get out there in the hands of the warfighter. Same for space. We need to make those very vulnerable, exquisite systems more resilient, and we're doing that in a variety of ways. But that is definitely job one. Lieutenant Colonel Higgins said something that is absolutely true. We have to build combat-ready forces. We have to consider ourselves warfighters first, and we have to train our guardians. Establish the culture, but also train in a high-end way. We have to train our guardians how to think and operate as if they're in combat. And we don't, quite have those types of systems yet. We don't have a Nellis range. We have a space flag, but we have to put together a national test and training range, which we're working on, so that we can develop combat-ready forces in that regard. And so looking mission area by mission area to modernize, make resilient, and build combat-ready people and forces, that's where you're going to see the Space Force continue to go.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. Something you kind of touched on, you mentioned having that resiliency. And so the first thought that really came to my mind was something I learned throughout my tenure at the Pentagon. And that is the fact that so much of the communications, I mean, if you think about my perspective, right, as a former F-18 pilot, carrier-based, middle of the ocean, and our lifeline back home or to higher headquarters was going to be, as we would call them, the bent pipes. The fact that we could use satellites to relay information, to send data back to the engineers, it's the lifeblood in some respects for the ability to command and control U.S. forces. So there's got to be some concern about capacity. And then you start throwing in some issues such as debris. The fact that other nations, I believe in the past, the United States actually did this as well, have used kinetic kill vehicles to take down either a satellite for a show of force, or they take it down because it's ailing and you need to get it out of orbit. So I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, maybe not tied to capacity per se, but how big of a threat is debris in space to some of our strategic assets? Is that something that we should be concerned about, or is that something that is overplayed in the media?
Oh no, it is. It's quite a concern, and we are working. In fact, Colonel Raj Agrawal mentioned the Department of Commerce. We are working on basically a deal with Commerce, where they take over space traffic management, And the Space Force focuses more on space domain awareness because the numbers of objects that we're tracking are growing exponentially. If I can remember a statistic I used recently, between this past December of 21 and this month, the number of objects that we're tracking in space has gone up 6,000. 6,000 more objects that we're tracking in space. I know that not all of those are active satellites, but many of them are with SpaceX's Starlink constellation, and many other companies are also building and designing it as we speak. Low Earth orbit proliferated constellations that on the one hand will actually provide more capacity to the warfighter. So, to build resilience, we're talking about adding to those high value assets, your bent pipe. We're going to add layers of capability. So it's not just in a certain specific orbit, but we're going to add different types of satellites in different orbits to create, basically a hybrid constellation. And that's part of where we're going with our resiliency. Also, we're going to add commercial to our capabilities, which will improve the capacity that our warfighters desperately need. But at the same time, we do have to worry about debris. And while the Space Force is not leading the effort with getting after debris, we are definitely flight following. We're working with NASA. We've signed an MOU with them to study how we may more scientifically come up with solutions for debris. It's not going to be squarely a Space Force. It's definitely not a Space Force mission set, but we will benefit from putting our heads together on this very real problem.
Thank you, General. I appreciate that. And you kind of touched on this. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword when you've got companies like SpaceX. I've worked in my retired capacity with several companies who are involved with launching CubeSats and small sats into space as proofs of concept for the type of sensors and the type of communication you can conduct. And of course, I can only imagine not only tracking, something maybe a little bit larger like SpaceX is using, but then you start getting into a lot of these smaller pieces and objects that are being launched into low Earth orbit. It's going to become very challenging. And with that being said, I wanted to switch back over and chat with Chris Ferguson again real quick, because I think he's going to see it from a little bit of a different lens. So General Armagno talked to us about the concern with debris and the impact it can have on your mission, especially for the warfighters. But I know in chatting with Chris prior to this conversation that he has some personal experiences with the very human impact that debris can have when you're an astronaut in space. So Chris, I would ask you to maybe share a little bit of your perspective on the concerns around debris in space.
Yeah, sure, Guy. So, General Armagno mentioned just in the last year or so, how the level of, I'll call it debris or objects in space has increased. I think just a little less than a year ago, Russia conducted a ground-up intercept of one of its defunct satellites in low Earth orbit and created over 1,500 pieces of trackable debris. Trackable is anywhere in the range of 10 centimeters of radar cross section. Each of those, would have the capacity to, inflict a mortal wound on, you just say, the International Space Station, for example, right, where we have, humans living there day in and day out, Russians included, for over 20 years now. So, it's an interesting environment. We also mentioned Starlink, in excess of 3,000 Starlink satellites, all in the, I'll call it 500-kilometer range, which is just a little bit above the area that the International Space Station operates in. And of course, we're not just talking about the International Space Station, we're talking about the vehicles that transverse to and from, the SpaceX Falcon 9, the Boeing, the Boeing Starliner. We all worry about these kind of things. You talked, Guy, about some personal experiences I had. One we had talked about, I'll mention that in just a second, but one we had not talked about was when I was serving as what they call the Capcom, capsule communicator, the one that translates mission control speak into astronaut speak. the voice of NASA, so to speak, with the astronauts aboard the International Space Station. And it was a mission that took place. I want to say it was about 2009, where we launched. We have what we call COLAs, and I'm sure our Space Force folks are very familiar with COLAs. It's basically a launch cutout, right? We can't launch because there's a predicted conjunction shortly after launch. We were free of all COLAs. We launched the space shuttle, and in just a few moments after main engine cutoff, we got sort of a flash, if you will, from, at the time it was Air Force Space Command, to say that we had a red conjunction with the vehicle that we had just launched, and it was a pop up. These kind of things happen, and I remember the flight director looked over at me and said, "Well." And a red conjunction, by the way, is something that is a potential conjunction between a piece of orbital debris and our vehicle. And he looked at me, he says, "What do I tell the crew?" And I said, "Well, I don't think there's really anything we can control at this point. So my vote would be to tell them nothing." Of course, nothing happened, but at the same time, I likened it to launching a rocket onto a spinning merry-go-round. We think we can predict all these things, but sometimes the unpredictable happens. What you and I had talked about last week, Guy, was on 2 of my 3 shuttle missions, we were hit by orbital debris, small orbital debris. One of them was, I'll call it galactic in nature. It was a micrometeoroid. It hit one of our windows and left a quarter-size, I wouldn't say hole, but a crack, right? And these windows are about 2 inches thick, but we were able to see it from the inside. Thought it was very interesting. Of course, nothing bad happened. But on another one, which we were completely unaware of until after landing, there was a 1/10 of an inch diameter hole on the inner liner of the payload bay doors. For those of you who remember the shuttle program, we had these doors that opened up. The inside surface of the doors was a radiator. It radiated heat to space. We had a hole. It was right next to one of our coolant tubes. If it had punctured that tube, we would have had to terminate the mission early. But they did a mass spectrometer analysis of the constituents of the residue, and it actually had the same constituency as a printed circuit board. So I think that sort of hit pretty close to home for me, and that was 15 years ago. So again, as Lieutenant Armagno or General Armagno had said, right, the environment is getting more challenging up there, and it's a threat, of course, not only to our national infrastructure and our satellites, our military satellites, but also to human spaceflight. We have to behave very responsibly. Just last week we saw China launched a segment of its space station. And they had an uncontrolled reentry of their booster segment, the Long March, which is a huge booster. And, in today's day and age, that is relatively irresponsible behavior. And I think our Space Force folks would agree with me that, we have to behave a little bit more, I'll say humanely, when it comes to protecting not just our space assets, but also our people on the ground from uncontrolled reentries of large vehicles.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. I'm kind of being mindful of the time. I'd like to be able to get through 2 more questions to both Colonel Agrawal and also to Chris Higgins before we get to our next question. So let me bring Raj back in real quick, and I want to kind of give you the fun question, if you will, and that's a little bit of the freebie. I had some pre-planned questions that I was curious about for General Armagno, and especially as we went through the first cycle or so, and I definitely wanted to ask both the General and Chris about their concerns or their experience with debris. I want to give you a little bit more of an open-ended question, and that is, you've risen through the ranks. You're now a colonel in the U.S. Space Force. What are some of the, you think about the diversity of our audience. We have a lot of people who don't have a background with space. Many in the audience are not from a military background. So if you had maybe 2 or 3 kind of just maybe fun kind of snippets, what are some things that you probably deal with on a daily basis that many of us haven't even thought about? Do you have anything like that for us?
That's a good question, and I'm sure that some of the other members of this panel will probably have thoughts on this too. So I joined a little bit later in life. I was a public school teacher before I decided I wanted to join. And when I joined, I started officer training school, and the 9/11 attacks happened during my officer training. And so the whole world kind of adjusted around that. And I'll tell you, I was not aware very much about the idea of diversity and inclusion until I became someone that was perceived as maybe someone foreign or somebody not safe, right? Because you go through that, the 9/11 attacks kind of changed the nature of what America perceived to be as a threat. And so my adapting to that new environment as now a member of the military was unique, maybe to me and others that maybe looked like me. And I found myself in a unique position of getting to mentor folks that had that different identity. I'm an Indian American. I didn't really think of myself as something other than American, and I don't think that Indian American means that. But I began to really appreciate the distinctiveness that everybody brought to the uniform, and started looking out for opportunities to help anyone feel like this is accessible, that each of us are valuable, and that we all can have an opportunity to contribute. So I wouldn't say it's funny, but if that was the context of your question, but it is absolutely thrilling to me to be used as a whole person in my service to my country, that it's not just about my warfighting capability or my ability to lead in a joint environment, but that people see me as a human being and are looking for that human connection. And that happens to me on a routine basis, certainly not just for those who might consider themselves to be of a diverse background, but across the board, getting to help each individual connect to their purpose in their role in national security is such a fulfilling thing for me, that when I've had opportunities throughout my career to maybe off-ramp or to find something different to do, I found myself continually compelled to come back to this, because I just love it. I love what I get to do, and I love the people I get to serve with, and I don't want to stop. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my answer.
No, it's awesome. Didn't know you were going to take it that way, but I'm really glad you did. And I'll tell you, because obviously from my vantage point, I see it almost 180 out, and only because of background experience and ideas, right? And that, when I first joined and I was going through the pilot training pipeline, here I am, I'm a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male, right? So it's like Mark 1, Mod 0 type of individual. And I remember as I continued my journey through the ranks, and especially working with Secretary Mattis, and you're talking to like the Office of Personnel and Readiness and others, and you learn very quickly how incredibly important it is to have the military members who are joining, both officer and enlisted, to be able to look up the ranks and say, look, I want to identify with my branch of service. I want to identify with what can I be? What are the options available to me? So I love the fact you say that, because that's something that we really wanted to focus in on. And I'm sure maybe after the next question, we can bring the general in on that as well from her background and experience. But it's one of those things where you just realize that there's a lot going on there to make sure that it's not just a diversity in background, experience, and ideas, but it's a diversity in race and gender and ethnicity. So all of that gets bundled in to help inspire and move the next generation forward. So thank you very much for that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Guy, I do think we have an opportunity as an American military to break down the argument by those who would compete with us that we're somehow we somehow look a certain way, believe a certain way, and speak a certain way. But if we can break that down and we are seen as composed of a diversity of people with different beliefs, but all valuing the same American belief, I think we become stronger in that. So anyway, but I look up to General Armagno, and I've heard her perspective in other venues, and I really hope that you bring that out, because with her being the first female general officer, it's inspired me. I'm the first Indian American colonel in the U.S. Space Force, and that's a pretty significant thing. The person that two lieutenants commissioned me in the Space Force, two second lieutenants, one of them was the first Indian American into the U.S. Space Force, Miriam Abraham, and it was just neat to be commissioned by two lieutenants to be brought in the service. But yeah, I'll pass it over to you, and I hope you get a chance to bring in General Armagno on that.
Yeah, you better believe I will. And I want to make sure I get to Colonel Higgins here in a second. But just to follow up on that, I think the so what there that really matters for this audience, because this applies in the commercial side of the house, across all industries as well. I'll never forget when my former boss, it was Admiral Jonathan Greener. He was the chief of naval operations for the U.S. Navy, right? So he's the senior most uniformed member. I was his speechwriter. And we were on a trip, and he was having a bilateral with the Chinese admiral at the time, Wu Shengli. And so as he got to know him, as he got to talk with his Russian counterparts in other nations, you realize how stovepipe the thinking was. It was very top down. It was a very centralized way of thinking. And that's what we learned very quickly has been part of the strength of America's military and part of the strength of our country in general is the fact that we do bring such a diversity of viewpoints, a diversity of background and experience. So I think that's an excellent point. Let me thank you very much, Colonel. Let me bring in Colonel Chris Higgins real quick for the last question before we jump to our final trivia question. Chris, one of the things that we've been talking about throughout, General touched on this in her remarks, the fact that they can now say publicly that electronic warfare is part of the mission for the Space Force. In our prep call, as we were getting to know each other, you mentioned you've had a little bit of a role in that. So I'm just wondering, can you maybe describe in layman's terms, what is electronic warfare? What is it? What does it mean for our armed forces? And then how, to the extent you can, what does that matter for us in space?
Yeah, so I'll try to keep the response not going too technical here, but yeah, I'm an electronic warfare operator by trade. I deployed 3 times overseas. So when we talk about electronic warfare in itself, there's 3 elements of it. There's electronic attack, electronic protection, and electronic surveillance. So really, if you look at what we view as the electromagnetic spectrum, this domain per se that enables critical functions such as satellite communications, it's an ability to attack that aspect of communications or whatnot that the adversary may be using the electromagnetic spectrum for in order to achieve their military objectives. So 2 different aspects, there's offense and defense for it. We as a Space Force, we provide, I'd say, more of the uplink version of it. You have the Air Force, which does a lot of the downlink versions of it. The Marines, the Army, the Navy also provide their own unique aspects of electronic warfare also. And that's pretty much what I have for that question.
I didn't want to box you into too much of either too technical or too something that you can't get into because it probably gets classified pretty quickly. But I appreciate that. Only for the interest of time, I'm going to come back to you for the final question here after the break. But I did want to ask our last trivia question, and then we can roll the final video for one of our gold sponsors for Amazon. So the final question is this. How many astronauts are currently in space? Or in space stations. So basically, how many astronauts are there in space right now? So how many astronauts are currently in space? If you want to go ahead and, it looks like the chat's populating, we'll go ahead and roll the final video from our sponsor, Amazon. All right, welcome back. And thanks again to all 3 of our gold sponsors, Booz Allen Hamilton, Vertex, and Amazon for their support of today's event. So we're going to do a kind of a speed round, if you will. We've only got a few minutes left in today's panel discussion. I did want to follow up on something that Colonel Agrawal had mentioned, and that is to bring General Armagno into the conversation about diversity real quick. I didn't get a chance because of time to read her bio, much like our astronaut, Chris Ferguson. If you go to Wikipedia, there's an excellent entry about her background, and I suspect she doesn't want me to go too deep into it, but you can read all about her background there. But she's a 1988 graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. She spent a majority of her time in the Air Force, and now, as Raj mentioned, she is the first female general for the U.S. Space Force. So I think the question I just gave you is maybe a somewhat specific one, and that is from the time you entered the U.S. Air Force Academy, you graduated in 1988, you rose through the ranks in the Air Force, now you're in the Space Force. What kind of impact has I guess, the approach to diversity had on your career? And then have you seen, changes in that 30 plus year career that you've enjoyed so far?
Well, Guy, I guess I would say that when I first joined, my dad immigrated from Italy when he was 16. And so I'm first generation too, Raj, first generation Italian American in my family. He wasn't thrilled about me to go to the Air Force Academy, but I wanted to go because I wanted to be an astronaut. So they taught us when we were young. I have two younger brothers, and they just taught us, if you want to do anything, in this world, you can. You just need to dream big and work hard. And they believed it. They taught us that. Both my parents were teachers, and I believed it. So I really wasn't thinking about diversity when I first went to the academy. But I was about, it was 10% women at the time. Now the academy is somewhere between 20 and 30%. I think they're striving for 30% women graduating. The Space Force is recruiting 30% women today, which is great. We are retaining maybe 20%. But it's different because I see a lot more women. I've been in many meetings, even units where I've been the only female officer, for example. Many meetings, the only woman at the table. But as Raj Agrawal said, now it's not just about diversity of gender. It's diversity of anything imaginable, diversity of skin color, religion, even age, sexual preference. I mean, and all this does is bring different viewpoints, different experiences and expertise to the table, where we can only be better for it. I mean, we're more creative. We are more innovative. And believe me, our young and diverse generation of Americans, they're patriotic and they're brave and they want to serve their country. They are absolutely incredible. And in the United States Space Force, we have a strategy we call the Guardian Ideal. So not to take too much time talking about a strategy document, but it really is meant to recruit amazing talent, retain that talent, professionally develop it, that talent individually all the way through their entire career, where we create an environment where everyone thrives. And that is our special sauce. I mean, when all Guardians are thriving, space superiority will be at our fingertips. And Russia and China just better watch out.
I appreciate it, General. Thank you very much. And I think your comments resound with that golden thread that I heard from both Raj and from Chris Higgins as well. And that is the people are the lifeblood of any organization. And if you get the people right, then a lot of times the mission will follow and the success and the excellence will follow. So thank you very much for that. I want to change gears real quick. I know in the interest of time, let me bring Chris Ferguson back in. And I think you're unique amongst, of course, the panelists in that when you think about who we have on this panel, you and I have gone through not only a career in the military, but you have successfully stepped out of uniform and joined the private sector. And when you think about Candorful as a 501c3, I mean, that's our mission, is to support the men and women who have served for some part of their career in uniform. Now they're transitioning to the private sector. So I'm curious, from your vantage point, as someone who's not only made that transition successfully, but then you've also found ways to move around within industry. What did you find to be most helpful as you were transitioning out of uniform? What were the things that you felt like you benefited from, and especially for some of our commercial sponsors, our corporate sponsors, the ones who actually mentor these men and women who are transitioning? What would you want them to know about that transition process where they could help?
Well, of course, it depends a little bit on where you go, but a lot of folks in the military, just follow follow their heritage and they end up, working in the defense world in some capacity. I was actually quite surprised when I joined Boeing. One of the first things they asked me to do was to be the executive champion of the Boeing, they called it BEVA at the time, the Boeing Veterans Association. And I was really quite impressed with how many active members there were, how welcoming Boeing was to bringing veterans in, almost to the extent of giving veterans preference, which I think a lot of us are familiar with, if you leave military service and go work for the government. It was a seamless transition for me. I found that my experience was welcome. It was sought after. And I felt as though, unlike most jobs when we first start, we feel a little bit like a fish out of water. I felt completely immersed, and I felt like my opinion really mattered. It was a very welcoming experience. And for anyone who is considering making that shift, your military experience, regardless of whether you served for 4 years or 34 years, is viewed in the commercial sector as priceless. And please go in with that attitude. And that was the way I felt. And I think you'll all probably have a very similar experience when you decide to make the transition.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. I can speak personally. I think back in 2018, when I transitioned out of uniform, I was actually one of the initial cadre who was going through the offering that Candorful has. And specifically for those who aren't familiar, it's 3 free interview prep sessions. So you're actually meeting up with someone like Pat, who has a wealth of experience in corporate America, or you're meeting up with someone like an Amazon or a Vertex or a Booz Allen Hamilton HR specialist who will sit there and basically prepare you. Because I remember thinking, hey, I've done 20 plus years in the U.S. military, but I've never really had to go into a job interview. And of course, a little bit fish out of water transitioning. So I think along with your comments, the things that I would definitely say are to reach out to those mentors, those men and women that maybe you knew in uniform who've transitioned out or who are in industries that you're interested in. Because much like it is inside the lifelines of the military services, when you get out as well, those mentors can really help set you up for success and get you pointed in the right direction. So, Raj, you and I had a couple back and forth, so I'm going to have to go straight over to Chris Higgins real quick and just kind of close out with him, but I appreciate you being a good sport about it. Chris, like I mentioned in the first round of questions, you're right at where the rubber meets the road as a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Space Force. So I'm curious from your perspective on the issue of transitioning out of military service and re-entering the private sector. When you engage with the men and women you work closely alongside, what are you hearing from them? What are their expectations? What are their concerns as they make that shift?
So I'm actually in a fortunate situation where my organization is made up of both DoD personnel and those that do work in the contracting world. And we do have a huge handover of those DoD personnel who, once they do retire, often do pursue those government civilian jobs or those contractor jobs that are available in our area. But one of the biggest concerns that I hear from my personnel who are getting ready to retire is that, there's this fear of being that fish out of water, that term that was already used, where, in the military, you have a pretty good safety jacket. You're not worrying about not getting paid. You're usually being taken care of by the DoD. You're being provided educational opportunities and a lot of unique opportunities that you're not usually provided elsewhere. So when you end up in that situation where you're stepping out of the DoD, you're often viewing yourself as stepping into a situation where you're walking into uncertainty. So the challenge is helping communicate to our personnel and to establish those resources for those personnel that are retiring to let them know that, hey, you're not out there, you're not alone. Organizations are out there that exist and will help you transition to that critical next phase in life.
Yeah, thanks. It's funny because I actually did a Veterans Day speech this last week. He was a retired Army Ranger. He was a major, and he was talking about the concept of having a battle buddy. And I think what you said kind of resonates, and that's one of those resounding themes you hear is that you want to have someone that you can always reach out to for support, whether it's in the lifelines of the uniform service or whether it's as you transition out. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate everyone's generosity of time. As most of you know, that's your most valuable resource. So to General Armagno, to Chris Ferguson, to Colonel Agrawal, and to Colonel Higgins, thank you very much for your participation, for dedicating an hour plus of your time to meet with us and to discuss space and the Space Force and NASA and Boeing. fascinating conversation. We probably could have gone another 3 or 4 hours and barely scratched the surface of all the exciting things happening in space. Pat Hubble did send over to me a list of the winners for tonight's drawings. So we have Aaron Dupe, we have Brandon Blosser, and Pedagai Shedrick were the 3 winners for tonight's quizzes. So congratulations to you. And once again, thank you very much for your support for Candorful, and we'll look forward to seeing you for the next Fireside Chat. Have a great evening.